Dust swirled around Silas's worn boots as he stepped off the stagecoach. The town of Redemption, ironically named, was a chaotic mess of tents, hastily built saloons, and a constant clang of pickaxes against rock. He clutched his Bible tighter, a beacon of hope in this den of earthly desires. He was young, barely 30, with a fervent belief in the power of salvation and a naive vision of transforming this godless place. His black suit, though simple, stood out starkly against the rough-and-tumble attire of the miners and gamblers. Silas had imagined a welcoming committee, perhaps a delegation of grateful townsfolk eager for spiritual guidance. Instead, he was met with stares, a few chuckles, and the general indifference of a town consumed by the lust for gold. He adjusted his spectacles, the afternoon sun glinting off the lenses, and began to preach, his voice a little shaky at first. He spoke of forgiveness, redemption, and the promise of a life beyond earthly riches. His words echoed in the dusty street, competing with the shouts of merchants and the raucous laughter spilling from the saloons. Few stopped to listen, most dismissing him as another wide-eyed fool destined to be swallowed whole by the harsh realities of the frontier. Despite the less than enthusiastic reception, Silas knew he was where he needed to be. These were souls in desperate need of guidance, even if they didn't know it yet. Redemption wasn't just a town. It was a fever dream fueled by gold. The air itself hummed with desperation. Every clink of a pan, every shouted claim, was a prayer to fortune, a gamble against ruin. Law was a distant whisper, barely audible above the din. The sheriff, a weary man named Bartlett, was outnumbered and outgunned, his authority often challenged by the brazen outlaws who roamed freely. Prospectors, their faces etched with years of hardship and fruitless digging, haunted the saloons, nursing watered-down whiskey and dreams of striking it rich. They were easy prey for card sharps and con men, who thrived on the miners' naivete and desperation. Then there were the families, drawn by the promise of a better life, only to find themselves struggling to survive in a place where basic necessities were overpriced and scarce. Women worked tirelessly in laundries and boarding houses, their children often left to fend for themselves in the dusty streets. The outlaws, led by the notorious Black Bart Callahan, were a constant threat. They preyed on vulnerable travelers, raided supply wagons, and generally held the town in a state of fear. Callahan, despite his brutality, possessed a certain charisma that drew some to his side. He offered a twisted sense of order in a chaotic world, a warped code of loyalty that appealed to those who felt abandoned by society. Redemption was a pressure cooker, a place where the lines between right and wrong blurred, and survival was the only law that truly mattered. Silas's idealism soon collided with the harsh reality of redemption. His sermons, delivered with unwavering conviction, were met with a mix of skepticism and outright mockery. The miners, hardened by years of toil and disappointment, saw little value in talk of heavenly rewards when earthly riches eluded them. The gamblers and saloon owners, profiting from the town's vices, viewed him as a threat to their livelihood. His makeshift church, a dilapidated tent on the outskirts of town, remained largely empty. The collection plate yielded only a few coins, barely enough to keep him fed. He supplemented his meager income by offering reading and writing lessons to the children of the town. But even that was a struggle, as many families couldn't afford the small fee. Poverty gnawed at him. His once pristine suit became threadbare, his shoes worn and cracked. He often went to bed hungry, his stomach rumbling in protest. The isolation was crushing. He missed the fellowship of other believers, the comforting routine of his former life. Doubts began to creep into his mind, whispering insidious questions about his purpose and his ability to make a difference in this godforsaken place. Was he truly helping anyone, or was he just a fool chasing a pipe dream? The weight of his struggles began to wear him down, testing the limits of his faith and his resolve. He started questioning if faith alone was enough to survive in redemption. One evening, as Silas was preparing a meager supper of beans and stale bread, a shadow fell across the doorway of his tent. It was Black Bart Callahan himself, flanked by two of his most imposing men. Callahan, despite his reputation, possessed a disarming smile and eyes that seemed to see right through a person. "Pastor," Callahan drawled, his voice surprisingly gentle, "heard you've been having a bit of trouble making ends meet." Silas, wary but intrigued, simply nodded. Callahan continued, "Redemption can be a hard place, especially for a man of the cloth. We admire your dedication." He paused, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Then came the offer. Callahan proposed that Silas provide a discreet service to the gang, using his sermons as cover to signal when shipments of goods were arriving and to occasionally transport small packages hidden within his wagon. In exchange, the gang would offer him protection from the town's riffraff and a steady income that would solve his financial woes. "Think of it as tithing to a higher power," Callahan said with a sardonic grin. "We ensure your survival, and you, well, you just keep doing what you're doing. Preaching, ministering. Nobody would ever suspect a thing." He left Silas with a pouch of gold, a down payment on his soul. The choice was now his: continue to struggle in poverty or accept the devil's bargain and secure his survival, albeit at a terrible cost. The weight of the gold felt heavy in Silas's hand, a tangible representation of the moral dilemma he now faced. The gold sat on his small wooden table, gleaming under the dim light of his lantern. It was a tangible solution to his problems, a way out of poverty, and a chance to rebuild his struggling church. But it came at a price, a compromise of his deeply held beliefs. Sleep offered no escape. He tossed and turned, haunted by visions of his past sermons, his own words condemning the very actions he was contemplating. He remembered his father, a stern but righteous man who had instilled in him a strong sense of right and wrong. What would his father think? He wrestled with Scripture, searching for justification, for a loophole that would allow him to reconcile his actions with his faith. He told himself that he could use the money to help others, to ease the suffering of the vulnerable families in redemption. Perhaps the ends could justify the means. But deep down, he knew he was deceiving himself. He was contemplating a pact with the devil, a betrayal of everything he stood for. The internal battle raged within him, a constant tug-of-war between his moral convictions and the desperate need to survive. He paced his small tent, the weight of his decision pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under its immense burden. Every shadow seemed to whisper temptations, every creak of the tent a reminder of his precarious situation. The gold was both a lifeline and a noose. The breaking point came not from a grand moral revelation, but from a simple, heartbreaking scene. A young mother, her face gaunt with hunger, approached him after a sparsely attended service. She pleaded for help, explaining that her child was sick and she had nothing to offer the doctor. Silas, his own pockets empty, could only offer words of comfort, a hollow gesture that felt like a betrayal. That night he made his decision. He convinced himself that he wasn't doing it for himself, but for the people who needed him. He rationalized that the good he could do with the outlaws' money outweighed the moral compromise. He would build a proper church, feed the hungry, and heal the sick. He would be a shepherd to his flock, even if it meant walking a path of shadows. He found Callahan at the saloon, the smoky air thick with the scent of whiskey and desperation. Silas, his face pale but resolute, simply nodded. Callahan grinned, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Welcome to the family, Pastor," he said, raising a glass in a silent toast. Silas felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a mixture of relief and profound regret. He had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. He had chosen survival, but at what cost? The weight of his decision settled upon him, heavier than any gold. He knew his soul had been stained. The next Sunday, Silas stood before his growing congregation, a new church building slowly taking shape behind him, funded by Callahan's gold. He preached about honesty, integrity, and the importance of following the righteous path. The words fell hollow in his mouth, a cruel mockery of his own actions. He saw the hopeful faces of his parishioners, their faith renewed by his apparent success, and the guilt gnawed at him. By day, he was Pastor Silas, the respected spiritual leader of redemption. He visited the sick, comforted the grieving, and offered guidance to those who sought it. But as darkness fell, he transformed. He met with Callahan's men in secret, relaying coded messages during his sermons, and occasionally transporting small packages hidden beneath sacks of grain in his wagon. He became adept at deception, compartmentalizing his two lives, building a wall between his public persona and his secret actions. The money flowed in, allowing him to provide for his community. He bought medicine for the sick, food for the hungry, and supplies for the church. He was hailed as a savior, a beacon of hope in a desperate town. But with each act of generosity, the weight of his hypocrisy grew heavier. He was living a lie, a dangerous game that could shatter at any moment, exposing him for the fraud he had become. The internal conflict never ceased. It was a constant battle between the man he wanted to be and the man he had become. Sheriff Bartlett, a man weathered by years of frontier life and hardened by the constant struggle against lawlessness, wasn't easily fooled. He'd noticed the sudden influx of wealth into Silas's church, the inexplicable turnaround in the pastor's fortunes. He'd also observed the subtle changes in Silas's demeanor, a guardedness in his eyes, a slight hesitation in his voice. He began to attend Silas's sermons, not for spiritual guidance, but to observe. He paid close attention to the pastor's words, searching for hidden meanings, subtle cues. He noticed the way Silas would subtly emphasize certain phrases, the timing of specific gestures. They seemed out of place, unnatural. Bartlett also started asking questions around town, discreetly probing for information about Silas's activities. He learned about the late-night meetings, the unusual cargo in Silas's wagon. Piecing together the fragments of information, a disturbing picture began to emerge. He couldn't shake the feeling that Silas was involved in something illicit, something connected to Callahan's gang. The sheriff's suspicion created a palpable tension in redemption. Silas felt Bartlett's gaze upon him during his sermons, a silent accusation that sent shivers down his spine. He knew it was only a matter of time before Bartlett uncovered the truth, and the thought filled him with dread. The walls were closing in, and his carefully constructed double life was on the verge of collapse. The pressure was mounting, threatening to expose him and shatter the fragile peace he had managed to create. The collision came in the form of a stagecoach robbery. Callahan's gang, emboldened by their success, planned a daring raid on the stage, carrying the town's payroll. Sheriff Bartlett, anticipating their move, organized a posse to protect the stage. Silas found himself caught in the middle. Callahan ordered Silas to use his Sunday sermon to subtly warn the townspeople to stay away from the stagecoach route, claiming a false outbreak of illness. Silas knew that if he complied, he would be directly aiding in a robbery that could result in bloodshed. But if he refused, he risked Callahan's wrath and the exposure of his own secrets. Torn between his loyalty to the outlaws and his commitment to his faith and the law, Silas faced his greatest moral crisis yet. He agonized over the decision, knowing that either choice would have devastating consequences. He considered warning Bartlett, but feared that Callahan would retaliate against his congregation. He contemplated fleeing redemption altogether, but knew he couldn't abandon the people who depended on him. The sermon loomed, a dark cloud hanging over his head. He stared at his Bible, searching for answers, for guidance, but found only silence. He was alone, trapped between two worlds, forced to choose between his soul and his survival. The fate of redemption, and his own, hung in the balance. He had to decide which master he would serve. On Sunday, Silas delivered his sermon, but instead of subtly warning people away from the stagecoach, he spoke of the dangers of greed and the importance of protecting the innocent. He didn't explicitly mention the robbery, but his words were a clear warning to those who had ears to hear. The consequences were swift and brutal. The stagecoach, forewarned, was ready for Callahan's gang. A fierce gunfight erupted, leaving several townsfolk wounded and one dead, a young boy caught in the crossfire. Callahan, furious at Silas's betrayal, sent a message. Silas's church would be spared, but he would pay the price for his defiance. The townspeople, initially grateful for Silas's warning, turned on him when they learned of his involvement with Callahan. They felt betrayed, their trust shattered. The mother of the boy who died cursed him, blaming him for her son's death. Sheriff Bartlett, though appreciative of the warning, arrested Silas for his complicity with the outlaws. Silas's actions, intended to protect his community, had resulted in tragedy and division. He had thought he could control the situation, but he had underestimated the forces he was dealing with. He was now facing the true cost of his choices, the loss of his reputation, the condemnation of his community, and the stain on his soul. The weight of his guilt was crushing, and he realized that he had not only failed to save redemption, but he had also brought darkness upon it. The dream of being a shepherd had turned into a nightmare. Confined to a jail cell, Silas was a broken man. Sheriff Bartlett, after gathering more evidence from captured gang members, revealed the full extent of Silas's involvement with Callahan to the town. The news spread like wildfire, confirming their worst fears and fueling their anger. A crowd gathered outside the jail, demanding justice. They saw Silas not as a misguided shepherd, but as a wolf in sheep's clothing, a hypocrite who had betrayed their trust for personal gain. They called for his hanging, their voices filled with rage and resentment. Inside his cell, Silas faced a crisis of faith. He had always believed in the power of redemption, but now he wondered if he himself was beyond saving. He had compromised his values, betrayed his community, and brought death and destruction upon redemption. Could God ever forgive him? He opened his Bible, but the words offered no comfort. He felt abandoned, not only by his community, but also by his God. He had sought to do good, but his actions had led to unimaginable suffering. He was a failure as a pastor, a failure as a man. As the angry mob grew louder outside, Silas wrestled with despair, questioning everything he had ever believed in. He wondered if there was any hope left for him, or if he was destined to face the consequences of his sins alone. The weight of his hypocrisy was almost unbearable. As the mob prepared to storm the jail, Callahan and his remaining gang members arrived, guns blazing. They intended to break Silas out, seeing him as a valuable asset, even in captivity. Sheriff Bartlett and his deputies, outnumbered but determined, stood their ground, a tense standoff ensuing. Amidst the chaos, Silas found himself at the center of a three-way conflict. Callahan called out to him, demanding he choose a side. The townspeople, their faces contorted with anger and fear, looked to him with a mixture of hatred and desperate hope. Bartlett, his eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and understanding, simply waited. Silas, stripped of his illusions and facing the consequences of his choices, knew he couldn't remain neutral any longer. He had to make a stand, not for himself, but for the soul of redemption. He emerged from the jail cell, unarmed, and stepped between the outlaws and the townspeople. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice surprisingly strong. He turned to Callahan, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I made a mistake. I let greed and fear guide my actions. I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to make amends." He then turned to the townspeople, his voice filled with remorse. "I betrayed your trust, and I am truly sorry. I will accept whatever punishment you deem fit." His decision was made. He would stand with redemption, even if it meant sacrificing himself. The final act was about to begin. Callahan, enraged by Silas's betrayal, raised his gun to shoot him, but before he could fire, a young woman from the congregation, Sarah, stepped forward. She was the same woman whose child Silas had helped when he first received Callahan's gold. "He may have made mistakes," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "but he also helped us. He built this church, he fed our children, and he warned us about the robbery." Others began to speak up, echoing Sarah's sentiments. They acknowledged Silas's flaws, but they also remembered his good deeds. Sheriff Bartlett, seeing the tide turning, lowered his gun. "The law must be upheld," he said, "but mercy also has its place." He proposed a compromise. Silas would serve a prison sentence for his crimes, but he would not be hanged. The town would decide his fate after his release. Silas accepted the sentence, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. As he was led away, he looked back at the townspeople, seeing not hatred, but a glimmer of hope. He had fallen from grace, but perhaps, one day, he could earn their forgiveness. Redemption began to rebuild, not only physically but also spiritually. The themes of redemption, forgiveness, and the complexities of morality lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the choices they had made and the path they had chosen. Silas's story became a legend, a cautionary tale about the seductive power of greed and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Even in a harsh world, forgiveness and redemption were possible, but they came at a price. The town had learned that even the most righteous can fall, and that true strength lies not in perfection, but in the willingness to atone for one's sins.